Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to part 14 of my Joseph Losey season. Today we're going to talk about the 1963 film The Servant. This is considered one of Losey's best films. It's one of my favourite Loseys, but not necessarily in the top 3 or 4. Now, this was essentially Losey's breakthrough film. Obviously, he'd been making films in various places and various guises under various names. But this was perhaps the first film that he almost kind of got what he wanted. I said in the last episode, the review of Eve, when Losey kind of tries to be art house, sometimes it doesn't work. In The Servant, it does work. It has a French feel to the film. It's based on a story from 1948, adapted by Harold Pinter, famous playwright. This is one of 3 adaptations or scripts with Losey and Pinter. It still had its issues between Losey and Pinter. Losey wanted changes and Pinter gave him those changes. The budget was £135,000, which doesn't sound a lot, but it was actually quite a lot of money in those days. But I suppose the way money has changed, if you consider the cast cost about under £19,000, you couldn't get away with that nowadays. Obviously it stars Dirk Bogarde, one of several collaborations with Losey after The Sleeping Tiger, which I've already covered. James Fox, in one of his early performances, he didn't really know what he was doing as far as acting on screen. Wendy Craig, in somewhat of a different role, if you're just familiar with Wendy Craig, in the British sitcom Butterflies, and Sarah Miles. There's really only 4 characters really. This is a chamber piece. This is the Studio Canal Blu-ray. Studio Canal also have a 4K, which apparently looks really good. This is a 2-disc set. The feature is presented in both 1.66 and 1.77 aspect ratios, if you have a preference. There is a locations featurette with Adam Scoville. There's a new video essay with Matthew Sweet, who of course does a lot of Studio Canal releases, and film critic Pyong Lee. There's a very entertaining interview with Richard Oyadie interviewing James Fox, which is hilarious. The trailer, there's an interview with Wendy Craig, there's an interview with Sarah Miles, there's an interview with Stephen Woolley, the famous British producer. There's a piece Harry Burton on Harold Pinter, and John Goldstream on Dirk Bogarde, who's a Dirk Bogarde biographer, and he also did a piece on the recent Studio Canal Blu-ray release of Sleeping Tiger. And there's an audio interview with Douglas Slocum, who was the DP. Originally, Losey wanted Christopher Chalice, who obviously did a lot of work with Powell and Pressburger and several British classics. And there's Joseph Losey at the New York Film Festival in 1963, and there's a Harold Pinter interview on the programme Tempo, and there's also a little piece with Joseph Losey talking about The Servant even. So it is a wonderful release. As I say, the 4K is supposed to look really gorgeous. It does have wonderful cinematography, and Losey, his shot composition is really top notch in this film, as far as regarding the characters, the position in the frame in relation to each other is sensationally done. Obviously, it has lots of Joseph Losey signatures. There's lots of mirrors, including, fun fact, the circular mirror that features in the film. We actually had one of those in the house growing up. In the 70s and 80s, we had the exact same mirror. So somehow I'm connected to Joseph Losey and the Servant. He uses a lot of mirrors, lots of reflection. It's interesting watching the film again. There's kind of three films that it reminds me of, all of which came after the fact. It's a fairly famous film. I would expect most people who are watching this to have seen it. But the three films it kind of reminds me of that followed it, there's a little bit of Bergman's persona, certainly in the last third, when it's essentially just Dirk Bogarde and James Fox in the house. It also obviously reminds one of Performance in 1970, obviously with James Fox, and that's about changing personality and morphing into somebody else as well, and consuming the soul of somebody else. And the other film it kind of reminds me of that came after it is Cronenberg's Dead Ringers. Again, the late part of that film where Jeremy Irons and Dave Irons, his brother, are kind of left alone in a state of kind of disrepair. And again, those final scenes near the end of the film with Bogarde and Fox kind of reminds me a little bit of nearer the end of Dead Ringers. But the film itself is a simple tale, but as usual with Losey films, there's lots going on underneath, about a young man who's rich and a bit of a wastrel. He's back from Africa and he's looking for a manservant to help him out in his new flat. And Dirk Bogarde appears. Quite interestingly, as a little note on Class, he does appear behind a sign for, I think it's Thomas Crapper, who's like Industries, and obviously that's a pseudonym for the toilet. And Dirk Bogarde appears from that direction of the shop. I'm sure that's not a comment on Class. And he decides to take on Barrett, played by Dirk Bogarde, who seems quite repressed and shy and very subservient. And then he comes up with the idea that should probably get a maid to help out as well, and that could be his sister, played by Sarah Miles. Tony, James Fox character, is engaged to Wendy Craig, who instantly dislikes Dirk Bogarde, doesn't trust him, thinks he's a little bit shady, and that leads to somewhat of a nasty atmosphere between the two. And then Sarah Miles, in her short skirt, because everybody's wearing them nowadays, gets James Fox attention, and then things deteriorate as the four characters' relationships with each other change and morph. And if you haven't seen it, that's all I'm going to kind of talk about it. Again, the score is kind of jazzy. Losey was a fan of jazz, and obviously the mirrors, the reflections, the pieces of art. There's nice humour as far as, when they go to meet the parents and they talk about Argentina and, the Argentinian cowboys called the ponchos rather than gauchos, which again is a nice critique on the rich not really knowing what they're talking about, but they're rich, so what does it matter? James Fox has this pipe dream of going to Brazil and being involved with this project that they're going to build 3 cities, not just one city, but 3 cities on the edge of the jungle. But he's never actually going to do that because he's just a bit of a wastrel who really needs to be told what to do, either by Wendy Craig or Dirk Bogarde. Losey got pneumonia while he was shooting this. It was shot in winter. Again, the themes of class, the themes of people trying to be something they're not, or wanting to be something that they're not, the facade of identity, and again the point of class and how you're born into something kind of determines what your life is going to be like. It does go into dark little areas. At times it's almost a gothic horror to some extent. Very light gothic horror, but there's certainly elements. Again, the black and white cinematography kind of really emphasises that. It has a wonderful ending that may upset some people because it's not necessarily all tied up neatly. Most of the characters do undergo a change throughout the journey of the film. The relationship between Fox and Bogarde, people have mentioned, there's perhaps a homosexual element to the film, even though Bogarde never really thought of it that way. He was just coming off Victim. I think didn't want to kind of have back-to-back homosexual films. I think it's more obviously master and servant, and that kind of switches round. But when they are on their own in those kind of later scenes where the house is kind of fallen into disrepair, they've fallen out, and they give it one more go, they almost do become a kind of husband and wife, and then they almost regress into being little boys when they're playing on the stairs, and they kind of go in the huff with each other. It's almost as if they regress back to little boys. And then the kind of final scene of the party, and Wendy Craig kind of turns up. She doesn't really recognise James Fox anymore, as he's become this different person and different character. And of course Wendy Craig doesn't really understand how and why this has happened. So again, there's a lot going on as far as the power struggles between different characters, how different characters react to each other. Dirk Bogarde is wonderful as a manipulative, sly, kind of confident, and James Fox as the kind of bumbling, naive toff, essentially. So there's a lot of Losey isms in the film. You do feel, if you've joined me on this journey, that Losey was always getting to this point, and certainly up to this point, The Servant is probably the most polished and the most complete, Losey product. Some filmmakers come out of the gate as almost like a finished product. Losey took a long time due to various reasons, blacklisting, having to do jobs to actually feed his family. But The Servant is pretty much the first kind of pole in the sand, which is not the right phrase, the first kind of marker laid down that, as I think somebody said, and I don't exactly know who said it, but it was kind of before The Servant, nobody really paid attention when Joseph Losey made a film, but after The Servant, he started getting attention and people going, oh, there's a new Joseph Losey film out. It was probably the first of his films to actually get kind of consistent critical acclaim, and up for prizes, and was relatively successful. Obviously, it does have short skirts in it, and there is some dark undertones, and it certainly was influential in what would come later in the 60s in British cinema. And again, I do think of Persona and Performance that came afterwards, and even a little bit of Dead Ringers, but again, that's probably just me. So it's a wonderful film. Again, lots of people think this is Losey's best, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with that, even though it's not my favourite Losey, and it's probably not my favourite one or two Losey, but it's certainly absolutely wonderful, and this release is fantastic, and as I say, apparently the 4K is wonderful as well. So that's The Servant, again, probably Losey's most famous film. If you asked 100 people in the street, I'm not sure what street you would ask them, but if you asked 100 people in the street, they might say The Servant for Joseph Losey's best and most famous film. But do you agree? Do you like The Servant? Or do you not like The Servant? So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below how you feel about The Servant, and hopefully you'll join me again for part 15 of Joseph Losey. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.